All right. Hello, students, class. Nice to see you again. Saturday here, September 23rd. This is a special video in our tech series on parametric and performance modeling. I just wanted to double down on a topic that seems to be coming up in a few discussions at your desks when we're having dialogue, as well as some conversations I'm seeing bubble up on Discord, either as DMs or, well, mostly DMs. So let's just go through things here. A reminder, generative landscapes, hypothesis is these three types. We're putting a pause on real-time rendering for now and focusing on parametric performance modeling and AI until we get stronger at these skills and understandings. And again, our emphasis on parametric and performance modeling is to make generators and evaluators. And we're focusing here in this video. We're doing it through geometric kernel of Rhino. So whatever limitations Rhino has, we need to abide by that. We are doing a lot of our parametric modeling with visual scripting via Grasshopper, and we will get into some specific elements of landscape specific features and operations with LandKit Pro. So the topic of this special video is mesh versus NURBS surfaces. I just really want to double down on this topic because I'm seeing some ambivalence or maybe confusion as to when would you employ one over the other. And I'm going to treat this more specifically, imagining mesh versus NURBS topographical surfaces for this video. And we're just going to talk about some technical differences, and I'm going to walk you through a file that's on the FTP, which I think will help illustrate these concepts in much more detail in a kind of hands-on way. So just a quick review. Rhinoceros, our weapon of choice for doing a lot of our modeling, is a combination of both NURBS modeling and mesh modeling. So when it was made as a plugin for AutoCAD, it was adding a NURBS modeling library component to it, as well as mesh library, which was novel. Again, its strengths, Rhino, it's, in my opinion, stronger in the NURBS curve and NURBS surface perspective, because that was its first and very strong emphasis at the time. But hey, it's also pretty good, and it keeps getting better at mesh. And remember that each of these approaches to making digital geometry is fundamentally different. NURBS has a series of points or curves that have influence, relative influence, over an object. So you can see a point here pulls, it has influence over this curve below. Or here, this kind of cage of points has influence over this surface. Meshes, on the other hand, are a lot more explicit. They are not modeled by influence. They are modeled directly. When you want something to be pushed to a certain level, it goes exactly there. It's much more explicit in its core philosophy. And they are made by putting together vertices, edges, faces, and polygons in the end, which comprise surfaces. Surfaces can be planar, they can be topographical, they can be all kinds. We already talked about curves and lines and how Rhino defaults onto a NURBS philosophy. So when you are working with a line, it's actually called a curve, just a curve with 0 degrees of curvature behind it. Again, curves were basically adopted from boat building and car building, industrial design background. Curves were made by adding weights, which influenced the degree of curvature. These weights would pull on a piece of balsa wood, which would bend it in a certain way. This has been a hot topic from my perspective inside of landscape architecture over the past 10 to 15 years, maybe a little more. And books like Gillian Wallace and Heike Rahman's Landscape Architecture and Digital Technologies attempted to start to break this down for people, where they described the history of both and they tried to tie in some conceptual thinking behind people like Antoine Picon, thinking about how maybe adding some philosophy that NURBS are emblematic of the creative space opened up by modeling. Honestly, this sounds a little, in my opinion, a little fuzzy and maybe not as realistic in terms of what you would probably experience in industry. While I'm not debating or rejecting the point of Antoine Picon, the fact that yes, creative spaces are more akin to thinking NURBS like, it doesn't help you in your efforts of making a generator or an evaluator or a topographical surface, to be perfectly honest. So I have some problems with this publication, even though it became a seminal text in how technology for landscape architecture is to be interpreted. And one of those areas that I think are a little erroneous is in a particular chapter that talks about these two different geometry types pretty early in the book. And it basically says here are three types of surfaces, topographical surfaces, and it calls one a NURBS surface, one a mesh surface, and one a sub-D surface or subdivision surface, which is another way of calling it from either a mesh or a NURBS. You can subdivide meshes or NURBS. So there's some fundamental problems that the two authors did not describe this in more explicit detail. But let's call out the obvious. The first example, not a mesh. Not a NURBS. This is a mesh. We can tell because it has triangular faces, or rather triangular lines that indicate edges that are cutting up these faces into smaller segments. A clear indication, a telltale sign that it is probably a mesh, not a NURBS. In the middle, yes, okay, it is a mesh, 100%. It is what we would call in technology a mixed mesh. It has a mixture of both triangle faces and quad faces, so spaces with four sides. It's just not in a quad format, so it's more of a polygonal mesh. You don't need to really worry about this. And it is a mesh, it just happens to be a low polygon count. And the last one, yes, it's subdivision, but no NURBS are applied here. It's unknown if this is a mesh or a NURBS behind the scenes. My suspicion is that it might be actually a mesh subdivision surface. If you want to learn more, again, as mentioned in technical parametric performance modeling's video number 1, Mode Lab, while making an amazing document called the Grasshopper Primer, also goes into fantastic detail describing differences between surface geometry and mesh geometry. And I am going to keep steering you back towards this website. I'll just show you that website here. This is what the website looks like, grasshopperprimer.com. It is a Git book, which means it's an interactive primer. You can go through here and basically, aside from downloading it as a PDF, this online version is much more up to date. And in the foundations sections, this is where you can learn about the difference of meshes and NURBS if you want, along with, of course, just understanding how do Grasshopper scripts work. How should you read them according to their colors? This is the definitive text on Grasshopper. It is commissioned by McNeil and Associates and David Rutten. They outsourced this job to this group called Node Lab, which does consultation and education, and they made this amazing document. So you can look at it for a variety of reasons. I'm going to keep steering you to this. This is a great learning resource. It's also on our Discord. But the element I wanted to highlight here is how to start working with meshes. So it tells you what is a mesh. How do you understand that meshes can be a composition of mesh triangles and mesh quads? Understanding topology. This is pretty key. I notice a lot of people, students, whether architects or landscape architects, kind of mixing up when they talk about topography and topology. These are two very different things. And topology is how you combine your vertices together in a certain way to get a different mesh result. So while I'm not expecting you to become experts in this, maybe give it a quick read. It's kind of handy, along with understanding local versus global influence, that implicit soft change that you see with NURBS versus more explicit local influence, and just how to create meshes, how you can work on meshes, like smoothing them out, blurring them even, coloring them, welding them together if you need, things like that. And how to interact with meshes. So extracting points, closest points, calculating them, doing Boolean operations with them. There's a lot you can do with both types. So I just call that out as a great learning resource and reference for you. So I'm not going to go through all this again. We covered this in video 1, but I just call it out that these resources exist and I reference them for myself consistently via the Mode Lab Grasshopper primer. Pros and cons for meshes and NURBS surfaces, mesh surfaces and NURBS surfaces for landscape architects. Why does it matter? Which geometry should you use for what reason? And are there trade-offs? Again, we are going to probably prioritize meshes over NURBS, at least in the application of landforming or making topography, because this tends to be the geometry that comes in from surveys. Point clouds, as Rob was mentioning very didactically and clear during class on Friday, September 22nd, that when a LiDAR scan goes over a site, it's bouncing a point and it's bringing it back. And those points can then be turned into an explicit mesh afterwards. Oops. Meshes tend to be a little easier from a computation side to calculate an analysis on. If you think about the zooming in example, I mean this example here, NURBS, you can keep zooming in and it looks the same because behind the scenes, mathematically, the curve is perfect. This is great if you want to make a perfect curve or surface for like a car body because you don't want it to feel faceted in real life. But this is not useful for landscape architects because if I asked you to calculate the sun, the percentage of sun on each of these squares, mathematically these squares go on forever, which means your analysis to calculate sun exposure on this surface would also take way longer. So the reason that I call out here that it's easier to compute is because when I zoom in on each of these squares here of this relatively same looking surface, this square does not change as I scale in. It stays the same relative size. So if I were to calculate sun on this, I now have, I don't know, it looks like 20, 10 in each direction. There's only 100 squares to calculate the sun on, versus here, there's an infinite amount of squares that the sun would be calculating on. This would take hours versus this taking minutes. Meshes are a common file type with other landscape modeling tools. SketchUp works in meshes. Autodesk InfraWorks works in meshes. Terrain Modelers works in meshes. So it's a more universal geometry type. The user can define more extreme elevation changes. You can get things like ridges or edges on meshes a little easier than you can on NURBS. This is now a little different with subdivision modeling inside of Rhino 7 and Rhino 8, but still I hold true that it's a little easier to get things like ridges. The user can always decide to smooth things out afterwards. So if you are working in a coarse mesh for general modeling rough purposes, and you're like, it's good for now, but later I wish it would be smooth, you can do that. You can always smooth out a mesh afterwards, but you cannot go reverses or inverse for a NURBS surface. And you can change your topology and mesh structure. This may or may not matter to you, but you have options. Here's some mesh modeling tools that I really enjoy. I use a tool called World Machine, which is similar in spirit to Grasshopper in some regard. There's a series of nodes called generators that make topography using black and white values that push up and down a surface. And you can modify it and even simulate things like erosion. But it follows a very similar generative design philosophy. And you can make some fantastic looking landscapes using meshes. So a lot of people think meshes are kind of coarse and ragged. I would challenge them by looking at tools like World Machine to see how beautiful you can make a mesh surface. And a lot of these are used in media and entertainment. When people are making a movie of a topography, an alien world, simulating something on a beach, whatever it might be, 95 to 99% of the time, they are using meshes. So where can you find source files or reference files in the FTP that would help you get a grasp on these two file types? In the performance and modeling folder, there is, again, surface generators, SGs, and there are surface evaluators, SVs. And for each of these two folders are going to be quite similar. NURBS versus mesh for generation and NURBS versus mesh for evaluation. I think they have the same file in them. They might just have a few extras here and there. So I'm going to walk you through that, and then we'll return to this general reference at the end, just to review things. So first things first, here is this file, surface generator mesh versus NURBS 3DM, and here is its corresponding Grasshopper file. So in the Grasshopper file, you will notice again, like most of them, I have bifocals on. I turn on my profiler to ensure I can notice speed. And I'm referencing in three texts here. I'm referencing in Parametric Design for Landscape Architects, Jillian Wallace on NURBS versus meshes, and landscape performance modeling using Rhino and Grasshopper. Because each of them has different opinions and approaches to working with NURBS versus mesh. And I think I was having a conversation with a few of you at your desk on how, let's say, um, uh, this author from Parametric Design for Landscape Architects has made a lot of his scripts starting with a surface and then dividing a surface to make points and then constructing a surface from points at the end. And I was just gonna show that, like, if in the end you make a surface, there are some limits downstream. And some of those limits downstream are basically being able to do a lot of analysis. So um, here's the same approach that the author of Parametric Design for Landscape Architects took in chapter 2. And I basically rebuilt it using a mesh where you create a mesh, deconstruct a mesh, get points again, and reconstruct it afterwards with vertices and faces. Now, the real benefit here is that you can analyze meshes in a much more rich way. One of the ways is you can measure slope a lot easier using a mesh surface. I talk about the science and the math behind this if you want, just to understand what's going on, if you want to change it for yourself. But basically, this is an example here of analyzing slope. So in this case, I've colored the mesh where the higher the slope, the more red the mesh is colored. The lower the slope value, the greener it is, and yellow is in between. Now, all of this is very much possible and arguably much easier to do with a mesh because you can measure discretized things like angles coming off of those faces, and you can color the mesh, which is something you cannot do with a NURBS surface. So again, I'm here to just really double down on why meshes tend to be used a lot more. Another element we may consider is aspect. For those of you not familiar with aspect, aspect is the ability to color a mesh depending on which way it is facing relative to the 4 cardinal directions, like north, south, east, west. So in this case, the mesh is colored such that blue is facing north. So you can see here, the blue is facing towards the y-axis. Green is facing east. Again, this piece of topography here, green, is facing the east direction, or in the x positive direction. Yellow is south. So you can see here, these faces are, actually, let me just turn on my pointer focus, might be easier to see. These faces here are facing south, and west is facing, orange are faces that are pointing in the westward direction. So maybe you might want to use this to calculate, I want to optimize my topography to face predominantly west. Maybe it needs to absorb more westward sunlight. If you recall from our first lecture, where Robert Ferry from Laggy joined us, he noticed a kind of energy profile and was saying humans tend to use energy later in the day when it starts to become darker. And it may be advantageous to tilt your topography or solar collectors towards westward facing sun so that you can collect energy at that peak time. So this is a way that aspect could be used to help you optimize your designs. Some more obvious ones are things like elevation. Just simply how to visualize a little bit of analysis, how to visualize elevation. The higher points are in yellow, and the lower points are in dark green. How this is done is you basically take your all of these are done the same pretty much. You're taking your vertices or something from a mesh and you're analyzing that mesh and then recoloring it using mesh colors. It's a fairly straightforward approach, really flexible. You can change colors pretty easily. You can change values and domains pretty easily. I would super recommend it. And you can build some easy legends and graphs to complement this. So that one is nothing too crazy. Um, Views. People were talking about wanting to simulate views. We talked about in a two-dimensional fashion how you could use Isovist, the 2D Isovist. There is a 3D Isovist you could also use. But if you wanted to take viewpoints from people, let me just actually turn on my mesh view here so you can see this. Basically, I have a couple of points of where people are. This is a point where a person might be. And I want to hit the mesh according to where this person might be standing. And so white is basically where they can see, and black is where they cannot see. So if you were thinking about safety on your site and you want to have more visibility, you may want to borrow this script to basically let you know if your design is getting more visible or more obstructed areas of your mesh. Probably pretty handy. And of course, you could consider multiple viewpoints. So here's a couple of positions of people. And here's a way to recolor the mesh such that you're considering both of their perspectives. Maybe somebody at the start of your park and somebody at the beach. And you want to know what is their relative amount of visibility topographically as they consider each other's positions. So again, white is more visibility, black is less, well, almost none, and gray is somewhere in between. And this little script here just gives you an idea as to how to take that into consideration. Again, these could be used as just graphical aids, or we could talk about ways that you can start to take data from these in order to optimize something. So this file here is for you to just see if I did a mesh, a NURBS surface, it looks super smooth. It creates these great contours. It looks very smooth. Again, I'm going to double down on that because that's what everyone wants, I suppose. But it has limitations. You can't really analyze a surface in the same way. And if you were to change the points of some of these, it would create, well, that was going to make different effects. Let me just pull out here and make sure I get the right geometry I want. Just going to let this catch up. Rhino is kind of freaking out here. Actually, I'm just going to pause the video while this processes in the background. Okay, sorry for that hiccup. Just Rhino got frozen for a couple seconds. But as you can see here, I can still move the model around. It makes things look super smooth, but I can't really analyze the mesh in the same way. So when you're looking at this particular file, again, it is surface generator mesh versus NURBS. Do pay attention to some of my notes. The notes are really going to help explain how things work. In red, They indicate what the impact might be on using a genetic algorithm, a GA, for multi-objective optimization. So I take some observational notes. And then in gray are just the notes of how this works. The green ones just tell you this is what it's going to do, what this little code chunk here is going to do. There are a couple more ways of, or a couple more code chunks here that show you some more ways of having fun, basically. Some of those happen up here at a much larger scale. So 200 meters by 200 meters as opposed to 50 by 50. And these here are just to show you how you can start to use some existing meshes, breaking it down, using attractor curves to pull these back and forth. And what I'm doing in this one, so there's a few different modifiers, curve modifier, multi-line, just ways of working with meshes. I tell you what it is that we're doing here. This case was particularly exciting because I'm able to use these attractor curves. Let me just minimize these guys. Control. It's on a separate layer for now. So here are these curves. So I'm using these curves, projecting them to the mesh, and basically from there, I'm going to find their closest point. I'm going to treat these like attractors. And you can see I'm able to start making these kind of pathways on top of these, on top of this mesh. So the green mesh underneath, oops. The green mesh underneath is pulled in, and I'm able to modify that mesh using these guide curves. Now I could make a new guide curve if I really wanted. And you can see it's pulling this to that point there. Now, again, you know, there are some pros and cons, and one of the cons is, hey, you're working with a mesh, it's going to have these kind of faceted edges. That is a condition of working with meshes. But the pro is that you can do all of these analyses that you would not be able to do in a NURBS surface. One of the big pros is that you can use, just turn the mesh preview off. You can use things like, I'll just put this under my draw. You can use mesh coloring to produce effects with your generative AI image making. Again, the reason why is because these tools such as Veris or LookXAI, they both will do the same, is that it takes whatever it sees on your viewport. So if you color your mesh a particular way, either by analysis or by some other means, you're able to potentially leverage that. Let me actually just get rid of this little descriptor here. I don't think I need this to be included in my image, although you could try, it might be fun experimentally speaking. So let's pull up Veris again, and I'm going to just refresh my viewport, and I'm going to here, just move my window over here and just take a look at these different things. I can put in these pre-trained models of style. I'm going to keep the first one on, Timber Autumn Realistic. It's the one that was out of the box for Veris to begin with. But now I can compose, maybe try a little geometry override, maybe making it a little bigger so that it captures the actual landscape in total. I'll say it is aerial view, and I'll just say that this is a grassy park with a and when I'm done setting up some parameters on this, I can render it and see what I get. I'm just clicking on these to create two renders. So as I'm waiting, I'm just kind of letting this happen in the background. But it's an exciting thing to let mesh analysis turn into something very different. In this case, whoa, not what I expected at all. Interesting, but super strange. Don't know what happened there. Maybe I need to say turbo nature. Maybe I want to have no geometry override. Let's try this again. So I'm still in compose, and it's still making a pretty strange view here. It's really interpreting this gray feature as something different. I'll leave it for you guys to experiment with more. I'm just going to close this up for now and just really encourage you, really get a handle on why we're going to be preferencing meshes over NURBS. Another reason why is because almost all of TopoKit from LandKit is based on meshes. So while these provide you some amazing shortcuts, the underlying mathematics behind it and way to hack it and way to enhance what you're seeing in TopoKit comes from just a understanding of how meshes behave. So let's go back to this quick overview. Meshes and NURBS surfaces for landscape architecture and more specifically for this class. Mesh surfaces, the pros, because it's a discrete or explicit geometry, tends to be a little more efficient, especially when there's less values. In other words, less resolution of the mesh. There's more manipulation potential. You can get ridges and edges and different kinds of hard effects. You can grade up to things. You can push things or sculpt them down. And the output to twin motion, much easier. It's already a mesh. Twin motion works in meshes. So why not have this already done? For evaluators, meshes have more analysis options. There's more consistent analysis because you might regularize your mesh. And so you're actually comparing apples to apples, one mesh face versus another mesh face. And you can turn your analysis into or influence generative AI images using Veris or LookX AI. The cons, going to be straight up, when you start to get very heavy meshes or higher resolution meshes, it can be a little heavy. So you might want to reduce the resolution for generators, but maybe increase the resolution for things like final designs. And as you saw in my example, not always able to produce smooth visual results, although you could add a smoothing operation onto it afterwards. The cons on the evaluator side, because it's a different geometry, it's going to make different analyses happen. And so there are some analyses in NURBS that you will not get with a mesh, and vice versa, to be quite honest. But it's way better to work with meshes for analysis. On the NURBS surface side, the generator side, the pro is because it's influencing geometry, it's efficient at many different scales. It tends to be a little less efficient when you have lots of NURBS surfaces. like hundreds or thousands of NURB surfaces, it gets a little buggy and slow. But for under 100, it's efficient and it achieves soft, smooth results. The evaluator is that it's hard to calculate precise limits. It's hard to calculate things like volume or area always because you can keep zooming in. It doesn't know where to stop the analysis. There are now fixes to this in Grasshopper, which is that it will borrow the decimal place value, but at the same time, you will notice that analysis takes longer. And there's just less analysis options, period. Aspect, slope, viewpoints, not as easy to calculate or at all calculate on a NURB surface. On the generator side, the cons, hard to achieve hard edges or ridges if that's something you want. And generally speaking, patching surfaces together. So if you make a topography here and a road or something else and you want to patch them or work on them together, this is really hard, like really hard. The impact of that hardness is that on the evaluator side, you're going to get less analysis options, less consistent analysis, and not an easy way to generate AI images. Because you can't color a mesh the same way that you would up here, you can't pull it into Veris and do some of these experimental tests. So just keep this cheat sheet in mind, the differences between these two geometries. Hopefully this helps answer a lot of questions around NURBS versus Mesh. And next we'll jump into LandKit.